Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing the spirit of compromise. I'm John Carroll of Boston University's College of Communication, and I'll be your moderator for this program. According to our speaker, eminent political thinker Dennis Thompson, compromise is necessary for successful governance. A rejection of compromise biases politics in favor of the status quo, even when the rejection risks crisis. Americans had firsthand experience of this during the 2011 debate ceiling impasse, and may be looking at it again when the lame duck 2012 Congress takes up across-the-board budget cuts mandated by the Debt Ceiling Act, the act that supposedly resolved the first crisis. And so the questions emerge: why is compromise so difficult in American politics today? What factors play into the loss of what Professor Thompson calls the compromising mindset necessary to avoid gridlock? What are the consequences of gridlock for democracy? What changes does he propose to our political institutions and systems that would foster the necessary spirit of compromise? Dennis Thompson is the Alfred North Whitehead Professor of Political Philosophy in the Government Department at Harvard University and founding director of Harvard's university-wide ethics program, now the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. His interest lies in ethics as a necessary condition for democracy to flourish, and he has written more than a dozen books and scores of articles over the course of his career. Among his recent books are Restoring Responsibility, Ethics in Government, Business, and Healthcare, Politics, Ethics, and Public Office, and Ethics in Congress, From Individual to Institutional Corruption. He is also the author, jointly with Amy Gutman, of The Spirit of Compromise, Why Governing Demands It, and Campaigning Undermines It, which serves as the basis for our discussion. Professor Thompson has carried his expertise in governmental ethics into public service, where he has been a consultant to the Joint Ethics Committee of the South African Parliament, the American Medical Association, the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, the Department of Health and Human Services, and to the Senate Ethics Committee in the investigation of the so-called Keating Five. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Dennis Thompson.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Pat, and the Cambridge Forum for inviting me. Thank you for coming. I'm going to begin, maybe gratitude isn't the way to begin, but with a quiz. I'm going to read a quote, see if you can recognize who said it. It's not the principled partisan, however obnoxious he may seem to his opponents, who degrades our public debate, but it's the preening, self-styled statesman who elevates compromise to a first principle. For the true statesmen are not defined by what they compromise, but by what they don't compromise.
Speak into the mic.
Am I speaking into the mic? That's not the correct answer, by the way.
Raise the mic a little.
How is that? Is it a little better? So that's just very good, yes. I think you got enough of the quote. That's just an excuse why you didn't get the correct answer. Any guesses? When I asked, no. Good guess, but not correct. When I asked my students, Hamilton is one answer, Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, Edmund Burke. The correct answer is Tom DeLay. The groan suggests that you know. Former majority leader, actually he's maybe about to go to prison. You'll remember his intransigence laid the groundwork for the Tea Party and the emergence of the Republican right wing in the House. But more significant for our purposes is that his speech expresses, in a particularly dramatic way, the attitude toward compromise that's come to dominate current politics. That attitude we call in the book the uncompromising mindset. And we define it as the attitude that politicians have who tenaciously draw lines in the sand and relentlessly demonize their opponents. Now, the uncompromising mindset is not bad in itself. It's perfectly appropriate in campaigns and in protest movements. The problem is that it has a tendency to spread, sort of like an invasive species, from where it belongs, to some extent, from its natural habitats, into places where it's not so helpful, specifically governing. To govern in a democracy, especially in a democracy where citizens disagree fundamentally and will continue to disagree fundamentally, in order to govern in that situation, political leaders have to compromise, as John said, as summarizing one of the themes of this book. They have to adapt what we call the compromising mindset, which we define and explain as prudently adjusting your principles and trying to respect your opponents. The tension between these two mindsets, attitudes, is inherent in the democratic process. It isn't that you can have one or the other. They're both necessary. The uncompromising mindset is necessary to win elections. We wouldn't want our candidates to actually suddenly say, as a candidate in Colorado did a few years ago, right in the middle of the campaign, she said, you know, I guess my Republican candidate is actually better for Colorado than I am, so I'm going to withdraw. Let's all support him. Let's all come together. That's not the way we want elections to run. That's certainly the Democratic Party in Colorado never had her run again for them. But the compromising attitude is necessary to make, and I would say unmake, laws. That's why this is neither liberal nor conservative view. Now, just to anticipate, I'm inclined, and I think my co-author, Amy Gutman, is inclined to agree with the many commentators who are now blaming the Republicans for the current dysfunction of Congress. And certainly the Republican Party has changed its character in recent years and makes the situation more difficult. But in the book, we're not interested so much in ascribing blame to one party or the other. We want to focus on the deeper structural problem, the tension in the democratic process itself, which is going to be there even if Republicans suddenly became reasonable. And this problem, this inherent tension, and it's inherent because you don't want to get rid of either of these attitudes or practices. But it has been exacerbated in recent years, we argue, because of what's been called the permanent campaign. Every day is election day. Three factors: the 24-hour news cycle that favors horse race coverage and caters to niche audiences. Second, the unending quest for money from donors, especially now, who have their own agenda and they tend to be more ideological and more extreme. And you've got to raise money all the time. And perhaps, maybe most important for our purposes, and also not talked about as much, the failure of legislators to develop and sustain personal and professional collegial relationships in the legislature, in Congress, or the same thing is true in state legislatures. That used to be possible, and I'll mention some examples in a minute, but it's completely collapsed now. Now, this sounds hopeless and pessimistic, and maybe that's the right attitude. But we argue in the book that compromise could still be possible in these circumstances, and we devote a lot of time, a whole chapter, in fact, in the book, to some reforms, which I'll mention, but largely to trying to dispel some widespread misconceptions about compromise, myths, obstacles that stand in the way of making compromise when they should and could be made. And so tonight, sort of as a way of having an organization here, I'm going to talk about 4 of them briefly. The first one is the idea that compromise is not possible because politics is so polarized and because politicians are so partisan. And it's true, no doubt this increased polarization and hyper-partisanship, which has in fact happened, we've heard so much about, it makes compromises harder, but not impossible. 3 examples. Very partisan politicians who pulled off compromise. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, neither ideological compatriots, and they didn't particularly like each other, but they came together with Bob Packwood and Rostenkowski in the mid-'80s to pull off the most important tax reform in our time, the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which is a classic compromise. It really was a set of contradictory principles where both sides sacrificed things they really cared about, but generally got a result that most observers thought was sort of coherent and crazy, but better than the status quo. Or Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, a story we in Massachusetts know. They both stood firmly on the right and left of their wings of their parties, but they got together effectively over many years and passed some measures that we would all agree were important. Support for victims of AIDS, maybe the Children's Health Insurance Program, the Disabilities Act. Those would not have happened had there not been real compromises, which, if you look at the legislation, it's kind of messy. Kennedy sacrificed some principles he's cared about, and so did Hatch. Or more recently, Dick Durbin and Tom Coburn, neither of them centrists in their parties, voted for the classic compromise that produced the Simpson-Bowles recommendation in that commission. That too is a classic compromise that nobody was happy with, but would have been better, most people agree, or at least it's now probably will be the framework for any kind of solution, if there ever is one, to the fiscal cliff that we're about to fall over. And also, Obama's getting criticized for not supporting his commission on that. Who's he getting criticized by? Ryan, who was on the commission, who didn't vote for it, by the way. So it may be easier to actually, if you're stand at the more extremes rather than at the center of your party, to pull off these compromises because you have credibility with your base. People are less likely to accuse Ted Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Dick Durbin, Tom Coburn of selling out. Their base believes them when they say, this is the best we could get. Because they have a track record of standing on principle, but they also are able to compromise when it's necessary. So polarization and partisanship don't necessarily make compromise impossible. The second misconception is that compromises have to be based on shared principles, or more popularly described, the common ground. Nothing's more common in contemporary politics than politicians calling for everybody to come on, let's get together and find the common ground. In fact, I want to read you an interview that Leslie Stahl of CBS did with John Boehner just before he became Speaker and after the Republic. In fact, rather than read it, because I don't do a Leslie Stahl imitation very well. Could I have a volunteer to read the part of Leslie Stahl? I think it'd be better if it's a woman. Here, how about you? Would you? There you are. If just speak in, I go first. So this comes in the interview just after Obama has been asked, how are you going to work with this guy, Boehner, who's been throwing bombs and causing, and Obama says, no, well, he's going to be speaker, and he realizes you have to govern, so the implication is you'll have to compromise. So Boehner says, I'll do my best Boehner imitation. We have to govern. That's what we were elected to do.
But governing means compromising.
It means working together.
It also means compromising.
I made clear I'm not going to compromise on my principles, nor am I going to compromise the will of the American people.
And you're saying, I want common ground, but I'm not going to compromise. I don't understand that. I really don't.
When you say the word compromise, a lot of Americans look up and say, uh-oh, they're going to sell me out.
You did compromise to get all the Bush tax cuts made permanent, in brackets.
We found common ground.
Why won't you say you're afraid of the word?
I reject the word. It's true. Thank you. Well done. She's got a future at this. I think I don't. The reason I do the Boehner impression so well is I grew up in a little town in Ohio where he would have been, if I had stayed, my representative. So I know the place and the people well. So Boehner rejects compromise because he doesn't want to acknowledge that that he's willing to give up anything. And classic compromises, you have to give up something. On the common ground, everybody wins. The trouble is, I mean, that's great, but in a pluralist democracy where there are all these disagreements, the common ground is often barren. Usually, the only way to make progress is to these, what I call classic compromises, where everybody sacrifices something they think valuable. It isn't win-win. So talk about common ground or consensus or even splitting the difference just postpones the hard choices that we have to make. And furthermore, it makes classic compromises, the messy things that people don't like, an excuse, or it makes them look disreputable in some sense. And it reinforces the resistance to trying to find ways to get satisfactory compromises. Now, our book's not a plea for compromise at any cost, but we do try to show efforts to formulate rules for when not to compromise, drawing lines in the sand. They're bound to fail. We have a long chapter where we go through lots of different theorists and politicians who've tried to provide criteria. You can't do it in advance. You shouldn't do it in advance, and if you try to do it in advance, I'm being attacked by bugs, probably some right-wing bug. So compromise is not a first principle, of course, and it's not an exclusively liberal or conservative principle. In a democracy, it's the necessary means for improving on the status quo and for avoiding disasters like the fiscal cliff that we almost fell over and off of and may face again in December. So this leads me to another misconception. The misconception is the belief that politicians can't compromise because voters don't want them to. Now, it's true. Congress is full of members now who signed the Norquist Pledge, never compromise on taxes. Do you know Norquist was a graduate of Harvard? that pledge is one of the fruits of the year of the pledge, which at its peak during the Republican primary in 2011, you remember, everybody, almost all the candidates and most of the members in the House now signed this pledge, the marriage vow. That was one of them. That was the one where you had to promise to be faithful to your wife. Who's going to not sign that? Maybe John Edwards or Newt, but they included, among other things, you have to also oppose same-sex marriage and fight against that great threat to American democracy, Sharia law. So that's the marriage vow. Anyhow, the fact is, in most recent surveys, large majorities of Republicans and Democrats, more Democrats than Republicans, but 70 to 90% numbers, say they want politicians who are willing to compromise and able to compromise. And here's a fact, a striking little factoid. A substantial majority of the Tea Party members, the one who had insisted on these pledges, during the debt ceiling crisis in the summer of 2011, said they would favor compromise, even if it required raising taxes. So this shows not only that pledges are a bad idea in democracies, that they have a long tradition in political theory and politics, but also that politicians have a lot more room for leadership and a lot more possibility to move on these than they sometimes suggest. Okay, the last myth or misconception I want to mention is the assumption that compromise is not possible or worth trying until the system is reformed. So you hear, some of you may want to say this, nothing can happen until A, we fix campaign finance or the primary system or the media or the Republican Party or whatever your preferred reform is. In the book, we do have a chapter on specific proposals for reform in an effort to try to tame or control this permanent campaign, to put the uncompromising mindset back in a little where it belongs. And we suggest we'd like to see the filibuster changed, the primary system opened up, campaign finance reshaped in various ways, turnout increased, the media improved. I'm sorry, John, I keep pointing at you. Civic education strengthened. We even propose lengthening the terms of members of Congress. Term limits are not helpful in this, if you want to talk about that. And we try to find ways for getting people to spend more, legislators, to spend more time in the legislature, in the Capitol, than at home. The opposite of what Newt Gingrich and a lot of progressives also say. So we can talk about those reforms, but if you're interested, but the larger basic point that people forget, that none of these, alone or together, can solve the problem until politicians and the public change their attitudes toward compromise, until they get over these obstacles and misconceptions we've been talking about and appreciate better the value and importance of compromise. So there's a catch-22 here. You have to be able to compromise in order to bring about any of these reforms. Where do you think they're going to come from? The reforms that would promote compromise depend on there being some attitudes toward compromise to begin with. It's institutional reform, no less than legislative action, requires a compromising mindset. So that's why we end this chapter on reform, and why I will end these brief remarks by quoting the Beatles, a tune some of you will remember. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing it or play it, Pat. It captures what partly this paradox, but also the importance of the way you think about and understand compromise in politics. You tell me it's the institutions? Well, you know, you'd better free your mind instead. Right? They didn't say mindset, but they could have said that. So thank you.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Dennis Thompson discussing his new book, The Spirit of Compromise. At this point, I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative and ask the first couple of questions. One I'd like to ask Professor Thompson is, one of the major recent uncompromises that occurred was the so-called grand bargain between Barack Obama and your pal, John Boehner. And just parenthetically, a little bit better tan would really help your impersonation.
Thank you. I'm working.
So this was going to be a significant combination of spending cuts and tax increases to the tune of, I believe, about $4 trillion. And they seem, from news reports, to get very close. And then two narratives emerged. It fell apart, and two narratives emerged. One was John Boehner saying Barack Obama lost his nerve. The other was Barack Obama saying John Boehner lost his nerve. Do you have any theory about why this got so close and then fell apart?
We don't yet know exactly what went on in that room. The best journalistic accounts that I've read, Ryan Lice at the New Yorker, suggest that it was Boehner who pulled the plug. But from the perspective of our theory, it fits very well in the sense that both of them had bases in their parties that they were worried about, and both saw elections coming. And it would have been a big risk to actually come to an agreement at that point. So, but your question took that for granted. It was such a big risk. So the question is really, why did they come so close? And I have to say that I think, and this is where it pains me to say it, I think John Boehner probably is potentially a leader, somebody who is willing, and would have been more willing if he hadn't ended up with the kind of unusually conservative membership after 2010 in the House, could have pulled this off. And I think Obama has made it clear that he is willing to compromise, and some of you may think, some of my Cambridge friends think, too willing to compromise. But that's why they came so close, and our explanation about the election, which is also it's always coming close on our theory in our society these days, because it's permanent. It prevented them from reaching the agreement.
You say in the book that politicians need to put aside their campaign commitments and electoral fortunes and sort of rise above those to achieve this mindset for the compromising mindset. Is that harder to do now, given the emergence of much more activist groups like the Tea Party, and also the combination of that and the media tools that everyone has to be able to go out and create their own story?
Yes, it is absolutely harder to do for some of the reasons you mentioned, and also for something I mentioned that people don't pay enough attention to. They don't know each other anymore. It's not just the electoral pressures, which, you know, in our society, you have to run for office every 2 years if you're in the House, and it was always there. But it became worse because of the media, because of fundraising, but also because they don't work together in the way that they did before. So Newt Gingrich comes to Washington in 1995 and says to the members, leave your families at home. We're only going to be here a couple days a week. I want you to not think about Congress or Washington, think about the people back home. Well, that sounds, good populist talk. The trouble is the people back home now are the bundlers, the people who raise your money, the special interests, and you don't get to know your colleagues. Part of compromising in a legislative situation is trust, which is that sounds like like you're buying a used car and you have to trust no, it's John and I are going to make a deal, and I don't know for sure, I don't know him well enough because we haven't worked together before to be able to tell whether he's bluffing, whether he's going to pull a fast one and the next time he'll be gone and somebody else will be there. If you have relationships over time, as Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan did, as Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, they knew each other. They didn't particularly like each other. And they certainly didn't agree, but they knew enough about one another to to judge what the pressures were and whether somebody was actually being honest or not. And they had a continuing relationship, what game theorists say, repeat players. So and that's what's missing, that kind of personal relationship. These other factors make it harder to compromise, but if you have good collegial relationships, you can govern, and then go back and face the electoral pressures in due course at the next election. You don't have to do it every minute.
And finally, for me, to conduct any kind of significant and effective public discourse, it seems you need a group of mutually agreed upon facts that you can use as a foundation to conduct your discussion and to argue out whatever it is you might want to argue out. It's been a while since I think we've seen the two ends of the political spectrum having that set of mutually agreed upon facts. This campaign beyond that, though, seems to be, it's what one observer called the post-truth presidential campaign. This is where the candidates seem to be creating their own realities. So this goes sort of a step beyond. Does that bode ill for the goals that you're setting and that you hope that politicians can rise to?
Yeah, that is a particularly disturbing development. It's truthiness, I guess, is what we now have, is Stephen Colbert's term. And it is really quite striking. I think it's maybe we're caught up in it, but I haven't, in my years of observing campaigns, I've seen a lot of misleading statements, and I even have a lecture on how to mislead your opponents, where I show ads from the past. But nothing like what we've seen here is that major politicians are able to state things that are manifestly untrue and presumably that they know are untrue, and they get called on it by factcheck.com or org, and doesn't seem to faze them, and they go on. This is, it's not only a problem for compromise, it's a problem for campaigning, too. I mean, there are some things that are bad for both governing and campaigning, and telling falsehoods, ignoring facts, denying that scientific facts and climate change, those things are not even part of the uncompromising mindset. I mean, the uncompromising mindset, which we say is a healthy, good thing to do in its place in the campaign, doesn't mean anything goes. It doesn't mean you should tell lies, you should tell untruths, and you should deny scientific facts when they exist. If that happens, we have not just an uncompromising mindset, but we have an ignorant mind, and probably, therefore, 47% of the public will, I've forgotten what the number is. So you get the idea.
Welcome to Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion with Harvard political philosopher Dennis Thompson on the role of compromise in government and governance and the causes and consequences of its absence inside the Beltway today. At this point in the program, we'll take questions from the audience. Please line up at the microphone, be succinct, and ask your question in the form of a question.
Hello. I think Obama, in my opinion, is an excellent pragmatic compromiser, maybe too much so. But assuming he's reelected, are we facing 4 years of lame duck governorship? And what can we do about that? How can things change to bring some capability into compromise?
Well, it's a good question. People say, when somebody like me says that's a good question, it means they don't have an answer to it. This is one of the common responses which you saw for both parties to the dysfunction of government in the last few years was wait till the next election, we will win, and then we will govern with our party in charge. So Mitch McConnell says, my main aim in this session of Congress is to see that Obama has a one-term president. So what do you ask? If you ask party operatives now, what are you going to do? They'll say, we're going to win. But this is a fantasy. In American democracy, it's not going to happen that any party is, in the foreseeable future, is going to get the presidency, both houses of Congress, filibuster-proof in the Senate, and sustain that. And even if they did, as Democrats did briefly, you still have this terrible problem of compromising within your own party. And the further problem is that legislation adopted by one party it isn't sustainable over a long period of time. So that escape that we Democrats, you might say, will take over and win, now, if you ask people in the White House or on the campaign now what they say, well, they think what will happen is the Republicans will realize, assuming they don't actually sweep everything this time, that this doesn't work and that they're going to have to work together. That's the hopeful solution, that what John suggested earlier, that Boehner will be able to bring along his base, and that Obama will be willing and able to pull together the compromise. Still, I think, I'm not in the business of predicting. Some of my political science colleagues predict elections, and maybe I should, because they don't do necessarily much better than you and I might do. But as Winston Churchill said, a politician is, and he could have said political scientist, politician is one who can tell you what's going to happen next week, next month, and next year, and then has the ability to explain afterwards why it didn't happen that way. So what I do think is the fiscal cliff is coming. Nobody likes it. There's going to have to be an agreement. And remember, there was a compromise in December 2010 with Obama and the Republicans, which I suspect a lot of you didn't like, because he gave in on extending the Bush tax cuts for everybody. But the Democrats got the extension of the unemployment benefits, which would have collapsed, and or they had to suffer the estate tax thing going. But they also got some sort of hidden benefits on jobs bill, so that some conservatives afterwards looked at this and said this was a stealth stimulus. But so that was a successful, from my point of view, compromise that Obama and the Republicans pulled off under pressure. And so will, I suspect, something happen like that in December, because it's terrifying for them to see what the sequester will bring on both sides. Yeah. I could say more, but the more I talk about this, the more pessimistic I would get. And so,
Maybe I'm being optimistic.
good.
But I wondered if you could comment on the tone of the electorate. Last year at this time, there was so much energy around Occupy Wall Street, the Move to Amend movement to counter the right wing. And it came to a head with all of these wild Republican candidates, ultimately culminating in the colony on the moon. And it seems like now the tone among the electorate is to reject the wild extremes, and we want sanity. So I'm hoping that the voice of the voter is going to prevail and bring us to the point of compromise that you're promoting.
Good, and I hope, and thank you for that, and that makes me feel a lot better. It does bring up the important point is that part of our electoral system is not just the politicians, but the system is structured in a way that discourages moderates. Primaries are, in some cases, closed primaries, as opposed to open primary. Closed primaries, only people in the party choose the candidates. Open primaries, of which there are many different kinds, you tend to get more moderate, or at least the campaign for the primary has to be more moderate. There are a number of other turnout. The more difficult you make it to register to vote, the more only activists, people like you, who unhappily in other parts of the country are not as reasonable as you are, it's the activists who come out and vote and control the outcome. Now, it's also the people who are best informed, but to make the choice between most major party candidates, you don't need to be very well informed. I mean, it's pretty clear what the choice is, and what you need are, and that's true for most of the Senate races and a lot of the House races and even state legislatures. People, ordinary citizens who are not activists would tend to be more moderate and do tend to be more moderate. So we could change a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, the electoral system to encourage people like you or to participate more than they do now, and that would help. Now, as it stands, the only movement for moderates, see if you remember this, a march on Washington by moderates was led by Jon Stewart of The Daily Show. So that's what we've come to. We have to rely on comedians to galvanize the moderates of our country. Now, and I'm glad I assume you're not a comedian, that there is somebody here who is ready to march, and I hope some of the rest of you are too, for this cause.
I was just curious why it seems that compromise is more likely and happens more frequently at the state and local level, the level of the state legislatures compared to the National Congress. And this is shown by the career of President Obama, that when he was a state legislator in Illinois, it seemed that he was able to work very productively and compromise with the Republican legislators there, but he's had less success being able to compromise with Republicans at the national level. And it does seem very puzzling for two reasons, one being that the state legislators are coming from the same polarized political parties as the national legislators. And secondly, it seems puzzling because of a Madisonian reason, which is that the national polity is more diverse than the state level. So you'd think there would be more pressure because of the diversity at the national level for moderation. So it seems that that difference between the state and the national level is puzzling.
Yeah, interesting. It's a good contrast. I haven't thought that much about that. It is the case that some of the pressures that I and John referred to and the book takes up are not as intense on state legislatures. That is, that they're not subject to quite the same 24/7 massive media coverage. The fundraising pressures are not quite so great. And because of that, they have more time for governing in between elections. It's not every day is election day in most state legislatures. And there's a coziness, they know each other. This is not all good, by the way. I mean, this is why, to some extent, state legislatures have traditionally been more corrupt than national legislatures. And so the relationships that I was praising and hoping we should have more of in Congress has its dark side. But it explains to some extent why compromise is possible. And one last point, just an example, the Michigan State Legislature, which is a good case study because they abolished term limits, they had no term limits, and then they put term limits into place. And you could observe the change there. Before the term limits, members knew each other, they cooperated, compromise got done, and the pressures of the election and the permanent campaign were less because they didn't have to, they had to run for election. They worried about the next election, but they didn't have to get everything done all at once. As soon as term limits were put into place, it broke down and it became more like Congress. So the structure of the state legislatures can be an example of what you might want to do with the national, or what you don't want to do with the national legislature. We don't want term limits, even if we could have them for Congress.
Thank you. Historically, the 1820s through the 1860s were a time when compromise didn't work very well for the country, and it kind of all fell apart. But clearly there was a single issue at the core of that, essentially, since I'm from the North, slavery. All I can see in this lack of compromise is straight power play for governance. Is there something, what do you see that I'm missing that's the core thing that we're not compromising about?
Oh, you mean the substance of what we're not compromising? Right. Yeah. Well,
what's politically behind all of this? What's the gain? Who's gaining what?
Well, unfortunately, the most striking examples are what we would lose. That is, the reason the compromise was so necessary, and in the summer of 2011, was that we would come close to defaulting on our debt, and the economy would plunge back into a worse recession. And similar economic disasters of that sort are facing us. Longer term things like immigration, climate change, if we can't come to some kind of agreement on those, if we just let things continue to go the way they are, the situation will really be, I don't have to be a Cassandra, it will be quite bad. And I think most people agree with that. They just hope that their solution to it can avoid it. So that's what's at stake. It isn't the dissolution of the Union as it was, and if it were that, then we might actually pick up our guns and fight for the principle. But the Founding Fathers were able to find a compromise in the Constitution that saved, or that enabled us to have a government. And if that compromise, which is still people argue about whether it was the right thing to do or not, if you think it was, then the compromises you have to make today, higher state taxes or lower taxes on small businesses, look pretty pale in comparison. So that's what's at stake.
Hi. So I'm just wondering, other than exercising our right to vote, and what you're suggesting that we might be able to actually march forward and try to do to improve the situation?
What would you like to do? No, what do you do now in politics?
What do I do now? I
Yeah.
try to,
You vote.
yeah?
Do you seek out, as our friend in the back, moderate candidates and support them? Do you?
Well, I think, once the primary situation has happened, you're
stuck. Yes.
And so, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm asking you, because, there's, obviously, it's a limited amount of things that one can do in the short run, because some of the problems I've been talking about are deep and will require civic education and more Cambridge forums and various things of that sort, and teaching things. We have a section in the book about civic education in the schools and getting the younger generation to begin to appreciate the importance of compromise. But I think some of the things to maybe put it negatively, do not ever support anybody who signs a pledge, whether it's a pledge never to vote to go to war. That says I'm talking to my Cambridge audience. Don't raise taxes. And this is a live issue in New Hampshire, where I sometimes go. You can't, I'm told, get elected to the state legislature without signing the pledge. Don't raise taxes. That's very bad. And so you, as a voter, if you were in New Hampshire or here, don't support candidates who say they're going to sign a pledge. You want candidates who will generally try to do what you think they should do, your policies, but don't lock them, are not locked into some promise. Campaign promises are a bad idea.
So we're writing letters to them when they're candidates or something? I don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
Go to the meetings, go to the opposition meetings and say, why are you promising never to raise taxes? Isn't that what got us into this mess? I mean, I think, one person, even as effective as I suspect you might be, I can't change the world. But I think just persistent challenges of how are you going to govern? I would say this to the media, too. I mean, they ask the candidate, what are you going to do when you're president, Mr. Romney? On day one, his day one's going to be a very long day. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And very rarely do they say, well, no, tell us actually how you're going to govern, because you're not going to have a Republican Senate, or if you're a Democrat, you're not going to have a filibuster-proof majority. What are you going to do? You don't have to tell us exactly what you're going to compromise on. That would be counterproductive. But are you going to establish relationships? How are you going to reconnect with? How are you going to overcome the distrust? What are the issues where you think there might be some room for negotiation? No, instead, the media and too many voters and too many party activists say, tell us what your positions are, as if once you're elected, you'll be able to put them in like that. And I think if you as voters and citizens can remind candidates and reporters that you're electing somebody to govern. That compromise is actually another word for governing. And not just somebody who is going to make promises and just going to enact tomorrow what he or she has been promising today.
Do you agree that the length of the congressional term should be extended? And would you tell us the rational arguments against doing that, and whether it's possible to compromise on that issue?
Yes, I do agree. You may remember, no, you won't remember, this was in the this was the Constitutional Convention, I hope you don't remember. The two-year term for the House was a compromise. Roger Sherman and some other members wanted to be 1 year before elections because they said that keeps you, and this is the rational argument, keeps you close in touch with your constituents. You don't get this Washington or then Philadelphia mentality, and it reminds you you're a representative of the people and not connected to the special interests that are in Washington. James Madison wanted 3 years because he thought, first, it took a certain amount of time for you to get acquainted with one another, very good point, and to learn the issues. And he also said, which was prescient in an interesting kind of way, you need time to go travel back and forth to Washington. I guess, you know, they didn't have, maybe they did have iPhones then. It seems we've always had them. But they didn't have, you know, the kind of transportation they have now. The reason I say it was prescient is now it isn't travel time, it's money time. That's what people need extra time for, is to fundraise. And what we could do is, and that's going to be true even if we fix the campaign finance reform system. So there have been at least 2 efforts, 2 bills that got through one House Congress to lengthen the terms. Lyndon Johnson, by the way, and made this in one of his addresses and as a proposal. So it's not something that hasn't been thought about. And it also has the advantage, you know, unlike some of the other reforms that we might like campaign finance reforms or redistricting and things like that, this is something that members of Congress like and can agree on. So in that sense, you could get you don't have to get a compromise, you get a kind of collusion. Let's extend our terms and so forth. So I would be in favor of a 4-year term for members of the House. You'd have to stagger it. There are a lot of different proposals out there. I don't want to go through all the details, but it would help. It would help. Another reason is that there are people who believe in term limits, and they think that you should go serve in Washington and go back home, and that service should be short, and so you don't get corrupted and stay around and become a lobbyist, which is actually now what a lot of people do.
You talked I think I'm following up on this last set of questions. You talked about some general principles that would be necessary to bring a more compromising mind into government in Washington. But can you give us a list of some of the specific things that might nudge us toward that more compromising mind? One you seem to be suggesting would be longer term limits. Are there other specific things that could be voted on by the Congress that would change their way of operating, that would promote compromise?
Yes, and you know, again, I want to say none of these alone will do the job. You're not asking for a panacea. And I'll go back and play the piano and sing the Beatles song again if we rely too much on changing the institutions. But one, we could, and Congress could do this themselves, change the way they do business. That is, they could be, and some Congress experts have actually proposed this, 3 weeks on and 1 week off, and the 3 weeks on is 9 to 5. They're actually there working. That would be an incentive to get to know each other, to stay in Washington, and then the proposal also includes provide housing and child care and make it much more comfortable for people to stay in Washington, to bring their families to Washington. Congress could, the Supreme Court has, in my view, mistakenly blocked so many ways of reforming campaign finance that there's not a lot you can do with prohibitions and limits. But Congress itself could ban fundraising during, as some state legislatures have, from January to June. For members. It could ban leadership PACs, which are a bad influence on Congress, and it could also ban fundraising outside of the district for members. Now, will they do that? I don't know. Probably not. But there's no constitutional objection to it, and it would really make a difference. The filibuster. You don't even have to abolish it, just actually make people use it, and if they're instead of threatening it. And this is a dramatic change. It's now, it used to be like 10% of the bills that ever came up this in the 1960s and 70s. Now it's something like 60 to 70% of all legislation has a filibuster threat, or what's even worse, a hold, which an individual member can anonymously put on a nomination. So I would just say, and there have been proposals about this, just say, if you're going to filibuster, okay, that protects the minority, but then you've got to come out and filibuster. You don't just threaten. And so we see who's doing it. And I think that would not put an end to it, but it would certainly help. So those are little, without even talking about, changing the media, civic education, or the electoral system, there are little rules changes that could make a difference.
Hi. Earlier in the evening, it was mentioned how some have concerns about over-compromise. And I'm curious if you think there can be such a thing as a bad compromise, or if there are risks associated with compromise, and if that might play into the current environment.
Yes, well, there certainly have been in the past bad compromises, and you remember the Cornhusker Compromise to the Ben Nelson and in order to get his vote for the health care bill, they offered to exempt Nebraska. Is that right? Yes. And that was so bad that even Ben Nelson said, I'm embarrassed. No, I don't want this benefit. So that would have been, that's an extreme example of one kind of common, so I said earlier, common ground compromises are great if you can get them, but they're just rare, or the common ground is bare. What I could have also said is that common ground compromises can be destructive. It's a certain kind of log rolling where, yes, everybody wins. That is, every member of Congress gets a little bit for his district, but we lose. The public loses. And so those are compromises. You get a bridge, I get a highway. And I'm not against all of those. I mean, there is this kind of, you have to do that kind of legislative business to get anything done. But too many of those, and some of the more egregious ones, are bad compromises. And then, there are the great bad compromises from international affairs and that world. But we don't say too much about that in the book.
I guess I have a lot of questions. One of the things that President Obama has been criticized for are his negotiating skills. And there is a feeling sometimes that he gives away too much and he doesn't know how to bargain in the bazaar. And it strikes me the public accepts this criticism, but it strikes me that perhaps this everybody can win, getting to yes mentality that we've learned from business schools has affected our ability to accept and understand compromise?
Well, yeah, there are two kinds of criticisms. One is that he's not very good at negotiating, and the other is that he compromises too much, gives away too much. On the first, I would challenge both of those, although there's certainly some truth in both. On the first, he isn't temperamentally as well suited to the kind of schmoozing, talking to, his colleagues as, say, Lyndon Johnson was, or Bill Clinton, or Ronald Reagan, even George W. Bush, in a way, had an easy personal manner and talked to the leadership of both and other people. Obama just doesn't like to do that. He really doesn't like some of the, Paul Ryan and even Eric Cantor, and I suspect they don't like him. So that's part of, as I was saying earlier, part of successful compromising, and he doesn't have it. What he does have, though, on still staying with this is a real sense of where there might be some room for an agreement, a real ability to listen to the other side and appreciate what might actually be possible. And he's a pragmatist, as earlier questioner said, and that helps a lot. So he's not an ideologue who has a simple view of the world, which that makes compromising much harder. So it's mixed. Temperamentally, not ideal. Intellectually, one of the best. And I don't mean theoretical intellectual like me and my colleagues. I mean somebody who really understands how to put together ideas and policies. Did he compromise too much? I think, if you outside of Cambridge, sometimes I think that people say he compromised too much. I mean, he didn't compromise enough. He didn't support the Simpson-Bowles compromise in the way that he should have, and that was probably a mistake. Although I can explain probably why he didn't. Would he have gotten more on the health care bill if he had compromised with the Republicans? No. I mean, surely nobody thinks that he didn't get any. Well, he got one Republican vote in the end. Representative from Louisiana, the most really good liberal. I don't know why he's in the Republican Party, and that was only after it was a done deal. So he compromised on his own position on health care. He didn't want the individual mandate. Hillary Clinton did. He switched on that. He gave up the public option. Do you think he should have stuck to that? Would that have? No, he wouldn't have gotten health care. So I don't think, given the current state, that we can say that he didn't compromise enough, given the various states of the party. And we forget now, Bill Clinton, and this master politician, it's amazing how time changes people's views. Welfare reform, big compromise. There are people in the city who still do not, who worked in his government, who do not forgive him for that compromise, even though I happen to think it was probably the right thing to do. He compromised with Newt Gingrich on a whole range of things. And so Obama, I don't want to completely defend him on this, but I think he is, and this goes back to your question earlier, better positioned to pull off compromises that we need on some of these major issues than probably any plausible president or presidential candidate that we've had in recent years, and I would include Bill Clinton in that. So if the Republicans and there already are some, can put themselves in the mindset of, we want to govern. They've got a president who I think has maybe not all the skills, but he certainly has the intelligence and pragmatic dispositions to pull it off.
Your field is ethics. The question I have in my mind is whether part of the problem is that the quality of the people that we have in Congress now is perhaps not what we would hope for people that are making major decisions for our country. I read a review of a book that's been written about the freshman class in the House of Representatives. I didn't read the book, but just reading the review was kind of horrifying. And people like Olivia Snow resigning because she said she can't take this my way or the highway mentality. And so it seems like it might be kind of a vicious circle that the kind of people that we would like to have in Congress might be repelled by that whole nasty kind of environment that's there now. I don't know if my question is clear, but.
Yeah, well, I think part of the problem is recruiting good people who want to govern rather than who want to make a point or want to become lobbyists, recruiting them to run for office. That's harder now. So that part certainly is right. I think there is a change, and it's because, I hesitate. I want to distinguish what you and I are saying from I assume you're saying, from the view that they're all corrupt and dishonest. And I don't think that's the problem, certainly not in Congress. On the whole, in my experience and looking over the history, I think probably the members of Congress, even the ones that you don't like, are pretty honest in the sense that they're not taking bribes and they're not engaged in corrupt practices, except insofar as the whole campaign finance system is a corrupt practice. That's everybody. But, the old-fashioned bribery and that used to take place doesn't, to the extent, doesn't anymore. But what's in some ways maybe worse is that you have people coming to Congress who really are coming not because they believe in governing. They either want to come and destroy government, that is, make it sort of dysfunctional so that we will recognize that we shouldn't spend so much money on it, or are ambitious not to be public servants, but to get a job as a lobbyist in Washington or back in their home state, or, which may be the worst of all, pure, honest, dedicated ideologues who believe very strongly in a simple mind, whether left or right, or happens to be more right now, program that they want to try to put into effect at all cost. And no matter, forgetting that they live in a democracy where there are people who don't agree with them and never will, and that we have to get together somehow and make laws, and that they want to make a point. They don't want to make laws. So given that's the kind of corruption or unethical conduct, it's not so much the old-fashioned, which there's still plenty around. There's but Dojgovich, whatever I keep fading from my mind. I can't even pronounce his name anymore. So that's the least of our worry. It's the ideologues, the would-be lobbyists, the people who want to destroy government rather than make it work. Those are the ones we have to worry about. And you're right, to the extent that those types tend to dominate, they don't even have to be in Washington, they can be in the campaigns, they can be in the movements. That's going to discourage people like you or people you would support from running for office.
Let me raise Joe Biden's name as a modern-day Tip O'Neill, a schmoozer.
Did I raise his name?
Pardon?
Did I raise Joe Biden?
No, let me.
Oh, okay.
And that he apparently can work with Mitch McConnell.
Yes.
And so how
Yes.
effective has he been so far in getting legislation and compromising? And how effective do you think he would be in the next term, that he might even want to be even more vocal, and Obama might let him take a little bit more of the heat off of this capability that Obama seems to be lacking?
I'm smiling because imagining Joe Biden becoming more vocal than he is now. If my co-author were here, Amy Gutman, she would sing the praises of Joe Biden even more than I would. She's worked with him and really has enormous personal respect for him. I don't know him as well, but what I do know from a distance is the agreement that we got in the temporarily solved the sovereign debt crisis in the summer of 2010 was, as I mentioned, McConnell and Biden, because they knew each other. You know, they don't agree by any means, and they're adversaries. McConnell says, you know, my aim is to get you guys out of here. That's all I care about. But because they had worked together, this goes back to my earlier theme, worked together in the Senate for years. They knew one another. They had a kind of grudging respect for one another. They knew how to talk. They knew they couldn't bluff because you know, they tried that 20 years ago. And so it was because of their behind-the-scenes work. And Biden has what Obama doesn't have, an ability to sort of schmooze and talk to people in the Senate. They pulled that off. And then again, that was also true for the extension of the unemployment benefits and the Bush tax cuts. That was behind the scenes, Biden working with McConnell. So it may very well be that the only thing I would differ with what you said is that I think Biden's would be not, it's not the best use of him to send him out as an attack dog, maybe in the campaign, but for governing, what you want is what he has, the ability to work with colleagues across the aisle in Congress in a quiet sort of way. I mean, it's the opposite of the way we think of Joe Biden. In a campaign, I would love to have him on my side, but even more, I would love to have him as my congressional negotiator. I'm a great fan of his. I think the talk of replacing him with Hillary Clinton was a foolish New York Times idea, even though I think she's been terrific as Secretary of State. So Biden is one of the reasons I have some hope for the possibility of compromise in the future. I'm glad you brought him up.
Thank you, Dennis Thompson.